Now, if you have a Bible, I would encourage you, please turn with me to Hebrews chapter 12. Believe it or not, we only have one more chapter left in our study, and I've been so excited to really walk through this book and to spend some time in it this last, almost 15 or 16 weeks, something like that. But we're getting ready, though, to put a bow on this study. And we're approaching this part of the book where I think the pastor who wrote this book is really trying to bring this message home. He's looking at his people and he's wanting them to finish in their faith well. He wants to help them endure persecution. And so we come to this incredible chapter, Hebrews chapter 12. Let's begin reading here in the first couple of verses. It says, "Therefore, since we were surrounded or are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. Let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. Think of all the hostility he endured from sinful people. Then you won't be weary and give up. After all, you have not yet given your lives in your struggle against sin." So we begin with this chapter with an important analogy, and it's really the center idea of this passage, which is that the life of faith is like a race, and I'm almost presuming a long distance race in mind. And some of you have done this. You've ran a 5K or a 10K or maybe even a marathon. But recently, my brother, who's 2 years younger than me, he just finished his first ultra marathon. He ran for 9 hours straight. And in fact, this is him, 50 miles for 9 hours straight. And this is him running around the backwoods of Montana. And he was telling me about this experience of running 50 miles, which, I mean, for me, 5 miles, like, that's impressive. 50 miles, it really is a superhuman feat in my estimation. I mean, just think about it. What would it take for you to be able to go out tomorrow and run 50 miles in 9 hours? I think the quite literal answer to that question is you would have to become probably an entirely different kind of person. You would have to eat differently. You would have to train differently. You would probably, frankly, have to stop doing things in your life because you were devoting so much time and energy to this one pursuit of running this incredible distance race. And I would say for my brother, that's probably true. Physiologically and from his habits, he's really become a different person in these last years as he is prepared to do things like run marathons and ultra endurance marathons. And the writer of Hebrews, as he's thinking about faith and trying to wrap this big message up to this audience, he likens the life of faith to a race that we run. And now it's interesting, when I was talking to my brother about the experience of what it was to run 50 miles, it was obviously a huge physical effort. But what's even more interesting to me is that he talked about the emotional aspect of the race. He said there are moments where you're running and you experience that thing they call runner's high. I only hear it exists. I've never experienced it myself. But he says, no, it's real. He's like, there are times where you're experiencing this almost euphoric sense of just, I don't know what it is. It's a runner's high. But he said there's also moments where you're just down in the depths. And you're just, it's everything you can do to take a new and another step. And just this incredible experience of what it meant to run 50 miles. And I think what we see in a race, especially when you kind of understand the nuance of it, a race is a struggle. It's a struggle against opponents and other competitors, of course. But I think most runners would tell you that really the struggle in a race is about yourself, about overcoming your own limitations. But we also know that in certain respects, sometimes a run can be against the environmental factors. Many of you don't know this, but there are these things called hills that occasionally runners have to encounter, where you're running and you have to climb a hill, and it requires a great deal of exertion. Sometimes you've ran in inclement weather where there's a headwind or rain or kind of wind or whatever there are. And so there's this idea that there's a struggle. And there's the big tension behind every race, especially a long endurance and a long distance race, is this: it's, will you finish? Will you be able to overcome the barriers to succeeding? And we see in this passage, there are a few barriers that are identified, and two in particular. And they're both labeled as sin, but there are some different understandings of this word. We see right here in verse 1, it says, "Let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up." Now, more specifically, when Hebrews is referring to sin here, he's referring to your sin. This is important in just a moment. He says, your sin is like a weight that will slow you down and trip you up. You know, a little while ago, I was going on a hike, and before I went on this, it was a long distance hike, so I decided I was gonna do some jogging to train for said backpacking trip. That's what it was. And so I was starting to do this. I would jog maybe 1 or 2 miles a day, a couple of times a week, just something to make sure that I had a base level of endurance. But when I was telling someone about this here at Bridgeway, they actually said, "Hey, I've got a present for you." And so the next week they show up and she brings this bag. It was my friend Janice. And she gives me this bag, and it looks like a little paper bag, and she puts it in my arms and it goes clunk straight to the floor. So I pull it out, and she has given me a weighted vest that was designed to be a running tool. So what you take this thing out, and I don't know what it's filled with, like lead beads or something. The thing weighs about 15 pounds. And so what happens is as you're running your normal training run, what you do is you throw this thing on, you strap it in, and then you just start running. And then you realize how big of an impact an extra 15 pounds has on you when you try to run with it. And I thought that was a perfect analogy for what sin does to us in our respective races of faith. It's like a weighted vest that holds you down. It's something that adds an extra impediment to what you are trying to do. And in fact, it even makes running more dangerous because it puts more stress on your joints and on your body. And so first of all, one of the struggles that we see from Hebrews' perspective is that when you're running your race, your sin is a serious barrier to you running the race. In fact, the first time I ever jogged with this training vest on, I was supposed to run 3 miles, and I barely was able to walk 1. And that's similar to what happens with sin in our lives, particularly your sin, is it weighs you down, and it trips you up, and it prevents you sometimes from finishing the race. But we see there's another type of sin here which is really important, that does have an impact on you and me. And just notice here in verse 3. Now, this is speaking about Jesus, but notice this. He says, "Think of all of the hostility he endured from sinful people." And it was this idea that Jesus and particularly his death and resurrection, or rather the passion where he's beaten and he's nailed to the cross, Jesus endured the sin, not of himself, but of others. We also see that in the background of this entire letter, we know that the church or churches that the author of Hebrews is addressing, they're experiencing persecution. They're experiencing the effects of living in a world that is opposed to the things of God. And so we see that on one hand, sin, of course, it represents things in our lives, our disobedience, and our poor decisions. But sin also is true in the sense that we experience the collective impact of other people's sin, whether it's directed at us or just simply the brokenness of living in a fallen world. And so these two things combine, and these are the big challenges for us when we're trying to run the race. Basically, your sin and their sin. Sin is what prevents some of us from finishing the race. And then we see here this question, well, how is it that we are supposed to run this race well? How are we going to finish in the faith? And we actually have seen a first hint about why or how we are supposed to run this race faithfully. Verse 2 says, we do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. You know, a while ago, I went and I watched my wife run a half marathon. And I remember observing her. You'd run and you go to different parts of the course and you'd cheer them on as they would go through. But I noticed there was something in this race. I kept noticing that every few minutes there would be a large group of people running in kind of a cluster. And it looked something like this. A whole bunch of people, maybe even some more people, and they'd be running around someone who was almost always carrying like a stick with a number on it. Now, do you know who this gentleman is at the front of this pack? He's called something in particular at a race. A pacer or a pacesetter. Now, a pacer, what their job is, it's very simple, but actually very helpful. They are, first of all, expert runners. Most of these people have run dozens, sometimes even up to 100 marathons. And they know exactly how to run the race at a certain pace. And so you would find someone, and on their flags, usually there's some sort of number written on it, and it would tell you, this is the pace at which I'm going to run the race. And if you want to run a race like me, it's really easy. When I step, you step. When I speed up, you speed up. When I slow down, you slow down. When I'm changing my cadence, you change your cadence. And it's this very simple idea that if you want to run a particular kind of race, you find the pace setter that represents the race you want to run, and you basically hitch yourselves to them and you run to the finish line. And if you stick with that pace setter, you will complete the race. And now we see for Hebrews, he says that pace setter, in the race of faith at least, is Jesus. Now that might sound obvious, but remember what has just become before this chapter, in chapter 11. Right? Chapter 12 says, therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses, and that's referring back to Hebrews chapter 11, where what do you see? You see the heroes of faith. Now, this is significant because if you are a Jewish person who's been saved and now you're following Jesus, there still is this question about how do I reconcile the faith that I grew up in and that I inherited versus my newfound faith in Jesus? And for a Jewish person, it would be a perfectly legitimate idea to say, well, my pace setter should be Moses. Because he's, of course, the greatest prophet in the nation of Israel. Someone might say, well, my pace setter is Abraham because he's the father of faith, or David, or any of these other heroes of faith. But Hebrews says, no. You need to make sure that your pace setter is Jesus himself. And so if you follow Jesus, he is, and I love how different versions render this, that he is the author and the finisher of your faith. He's the pioneer and perfecter. He's your champion. And if you align yourself to him, you will ultimately finish the race well. And so he says the first thing you need is an example, a pacer or a pace setter that you can follow after. But that's actually not the only thing you need to finish a race. In fact, any elite athlete will, all of them, regardless of their particular discipline, they all possess one thing in common. Turns out you need, in fact, more than Jesus, if I may say that, to finish the race. You also need discipline. In fact, discipline is used 9 times in the rest of this chapter, and really it's the main focus of what Hebrews is trying to convey to us. And let me read you out of verse 5 now. He says, "And have you forgotten the encouraging words God spoke to you as his children? He said, 'My child, don't make light of the Lord's discipline, and don't give up when he corrects you. For the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes each one he accepts as a child.'" May I make an observation first, that none of us see that as encouraging. And in fact, the literal word is an exhortation. This is something that should make us feel really good, that God punishes you if he considers you his child. And hence, we jump into a big conversation about what it means to be disciplined by God. And in fact, if you notice, this is actually a quotation. Now, Hebrews 12 is referring directly back to and quoting Proverbs chapter 3. And you might know this if you've been with us on this study, that Hebrews assumes that you know most of your Old Testament probably by heart, and that you would be able to instantly tell you or a friend of yours what Proverbs 3 is all about. Given that I'm going to guess most people here cannot do that, we have to take a step back into the Old Testament and we have to understand what's the basic message of Proverbs chapter 3 that Hebrews is trying to get us to call to mind. Now, Proverbs chapter 3 is largely speaking, most commentators believe it's cut into two parts. And the main part is verses 1 through 12. That's the core of the proverb. And the rest of the chapter is really sort of a kind of a self-commentary. And now the first 12 verses are broken into basically three big messages, and I want to summarize them for you so you can appreciate the overarching message. Now, the first part of the psalm, the proverb, I should say, is verse 1 through 4, and it describes a quality of life. Let me read you just one verse. It says, "If you do this, you will live many years, and your life will be satisfying." Now, for anyone, does a long, satisfying life sound appealing? Sounds appealing to me. And so we begin at the first part of this proverb by seeing a quality of life that, frankly, most of us want to attain. And there's nothing wrong with that. By the way, Scripture, in fact, encourages us to live a life that is long and that is satisfying. And so we see this kind of the aspiration here, but then we see in part 2, which is verses 5 through 8 roughly, how we are to experience this quality of life. And we find that was only found through relationship with God. In fact, many of you will recognize this verse. It might be even one of your life verses. It says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take." And so if we want to achieve this particular quality of life, this type of life that's long and that's prosperous and satisfying, all these things, the way to achieve that is not through your own understanding. It's through a correct relationship with God, right? Where you trust his understanding, you lean on his will, and you don't do it on your own power. And so we see here there's a fundamental relationship with God that is necessary to achieve this quality of life. Then we see part 3, and this is really the rubber meeting the road, which the proverb is trying to answer this question: how is it that we actually go about experiencing this type of life? And the answer may be partially surprising. It says, "Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the best part of everything you produce." So if you want to experience a long, satisfying life, what you do is you honor God with how he has blessed you, right? It seems like wealth and everything you produce, those are all good things that God has given you. And so it says, okay, first of all, you need to honor God with that. But then verse 11, this is the part where it's like there's like an asterisk here. Also, don't reject the Lord's discipline, and don't be upset when he corrects you, because the Lord corrects those he loves, just as a father corrects a child in whom he delights. And that's the quotation that Hebrews borrows from. But you see here, it's more than just discipline. What Proverbs 3 is telling us as a broader statement is that, yes, we all desire to live a prosperous life, a blessed life. And I do think when we look at a life of faith, I think we could confidently say that there will be blessings, whether those are material or spiritual or otherwise. A life of faith is worth living. If you want to live a life of faith or to run the race well, you do that not by your own power and understanding, but rather to live in God's will for your life. And the way we do that is that we honor God with our possessions and his blessings, but we also realize that his discipline is a gift to us as well. Now, the problem is, most of us do not like discipline. In fact, let's go back to Hebrews chapter 12, verse 7. Now, we're going to talk about what it means when we talk about discipline. Now, the first part of this verse, your verse might have a comma. Mine says, as you endure this divine discipline, comma. Now, I want to tell you that in the Greek, that is an actual, full, complete sentence. The problem is it's sort of hard to translate, and it doesn't translate well into English. And so the literal translation of that verse is, for discipline, endure, period. That's the whole sentence. For discipline, endure. And so it's this first idea of like, okay, what does that exactly mean? And just remember though, we've identified two big problems, right? That are gonna prevent us from finishing the race. The first is your sin, but the second is other people's sin, or perhaps even the general brokenness of the world. And I believe what Hebrews is addressing first off is this question of what do we do just in the face of living in a broken world, which has sin and disease and brokenness, and also sometimes even outright persecution and resistance to the gospel. What are we supposed to do with that? Hebrews says, for discipline, endure. It's like that athlete who is training for their marathon, and they wake up, and this morning it's cold and it's windy, and the route that they are running is hilly and it's got challenges. It's that kind of discipline. And so Hebrews is saying, when you experience that spiritually, and again, man, aren't we just feeling that at times, where you feel there's opposition, and maybe it's something specific, but maybe it's just like that general thing in the ether that seems to be preventing you from running the race of faith. Hebrews is saying, endure for discipline. Run. Get out, and it's gonna be cold, and it's gonna be hard, or it's gonna be too hot. There's gonna be a mountain there, and you gotta run it. For discipline, endure. That's one of the messages of Hebrews. People are persecuting you, and they're coming and arresting you in your house churches. For discipline, endure. That's one response. The second response deals with the other type of sin. It says, remember that God is treating you as his own children. And who ever heard of a child who is never disciplined by its father? Clearly, the writer of Hebrews has never grown up in America in the 21st century. If God doesn't discipline you as he does all of his children, it means that you are illegitimate and not really his children at all. Since we respected our earthly fathers who disciplined us, shouldn't we submit even more to the discipline of the Father of our spirits and live forever? This seems to be directed at not the sin of the world, but your sin and my sin. It seems to be a statement about how God, as our heavenly Father, right? And we understand this, that the proper discipline is always an expression of love. Now, it's true that from a human perspective, it is very true that sometimes as parents or other people, we can discipline poorly. We can discipline for the wrong motives, and we can discipline the wrong ways. That's true. But we serve for God. He always disciplines us well, and he disciplines us as an expression of love. And so what's happening? God, like you do with your children, right? You look into their lives and you see things that need to be dealt with. And when kids are little, it's usually, I've got 3 boys, so it's, usually one of my boys has punched one of my others. That's usually what it is. Or someone's not sharing. Or someone has taken an extra set of Ritz crackers and they lied about it, and we see these things, but as parents, we're wise. We see that there are seeds being planted that I have to root out because I don't want those things to grow. And so what do I do as a parent? I lovingly and with as much wisdom as I can, I am going to root out those behaviors and activities that I know, ironically, not only do they go against my will for my child's life, I know that it will ultimately prevent them from experiencing what they want out of their life. In fact, when I was growing up, my mother, who was a brilliant woman and an incredible spiritual influence, whenever she would discipline us, she was doing it always with the spiritual dimension in mind. And she always used this analogy. She would say, son, or I have brother and sister. She would say, I am pruning you. I'm pruning you. That's what discipline is. And it's a beautiful analogy. Have you ever seen those bonsai trees? They're just these small, intricately designed trees, and it's very simple. There's a long process to which a very attentive gardener will take a pair of scissors and just make little tiny cuts to this tree. And over months or even years, I think, these bonsai trees, they grow into literally pieces of art. And they're these incredible, exquisite trees, and I think that's exactly what discipline is designed to do for us. So what does God see? God sees, he's like, well, that I see which way that branch is growing, and I know what that's going to do, so I'm going to prune it. I'm going to cut it. I'm going to remove that behavior. And for our parents, it was usually a timeout or maybe a spanking or a removed privilege, whatever it is. And what Hebrews is saying is like, yeah, that's what God does to us, and he does it perfectly and for your good because he loves you. But of course, what is our response to our parents' discipline as well as God's discipline? We approach it kicking and screaming, do we not? I mean, just imagine, when you were a kid, I remember one time, I did something wrong, and I remember the penalty for this particular transgression was a spanking. Right? Did anyone grow up just getting the spankings? Is that okay to talk about in church? Okay. We do live in Texas, and God bless us all. You can't talk about that on the West Coast, otherwise you'll get called. I was lovingly and appropriately at times spanked, but I still remember, like when you were about to get spanked as a kid, when you came and your mom or your dad was about to dole out the punishment, and they've got you ready. Did you ever like, you know what? Hey, I just want to let you know, mom and dad, that first of all, I really appreciate this. This is for my good, and I accept this as an expression of love and kindness, and most importantly, I understand that this is going to hurt you way more than it's going to hurt me, right? So just go for it, right? No, that's not how it works. We resist our parents' discipline. We resist God's discipline. And just think about some of the horrible things your kids have said to you when you've tried to discipline them. I mean, there's the always popular, mom and dad, you just hate me. You just don't want me to have any fun. You just are, like, right? All the same things we say to God. And now, let me be clear. I am not trying to insinuate that every bad thing in your life has happened to you because God is specifically disciplining you. Again, there's two different aspects of discipline. Sometimes you're experiencing the brokenness and the sinfulness of other people, also a gift from God. But sometimes God, it seems, as a loving parent, will allow you to experience consequences. My experience has been that overwhelmingly, this is just simply God saying yes to whatever it is I've asked. He allows me to experience the logical consequence of my choices. I think that's how God usually disciplines us. But then, I don't like that because my sin has produced things in my life that I don't really want, but yet I turn around and what do I say? I say, God, you must hate me. You must not really love me. You must just not want me to be happy. And of course, God, as our heavenly parent, said that couldn't be farther from the truth. I'm disciplining you because I love you. And so there's an entirely different kind of orientation, right? Because what's happening? Well, there's two different types of sin. There's two different types of discipline. There's your sin, and the discipline for that is God disciplining and correcting you, and pruning you and rooting that stuff out of your life, and that hurts. It's painful, but that's from God. There's also the side of things where it's not your sin necessarily. It's, hey, we're living in a broken world that is antithetical to the gospel and the kingdom, and that's just gonna, at some point, that's gonna be really tough to live in. And so for discipline, endure. Like there's that kind of discipline. But what's the net result? Well, this is God's discipline, so it's perfect and it's good for us. So just like a bonsai tree, it shapes our character. It changes us. Remember, what does it take for you to run a 50-mile-an-hour or 50-mile race? You have to become a different person. And the same is true when it comes to a race of faith. You have to become an entirely different person. And the way that God does that is through discipline. And we resist this, of course. But look at what happens. Verse 10. For our earthly fathers disciplined us for a few years, doing the best they knew how, right? Sometimes parents, we mess up and we get disciplined wrong. But God's discipline is always good for us, so that we might share in his holiness. And here it is. No discipline is enjoyable while it is happening. It's painful. But afterward, there will be a peaceful harvest of right living or righteousness for those who are trained in this way. God disciplines you and me because he loves us. And so maybe the question for us is simply, well, how are we doing relating to a loving God and his discipline? Are we accepting it as a gift, knowing that it is for our good even though it's hurting us? Or frankly, are we having a fit just like our children have done so many times to us? You know, when we realize that these are gifts from God, that even things like persecution and just the general struggle, as well as God pruning us and correcting us, when we realize these are gifts, it's the key to cultivating a life that is shaped by his discipline. And it is that life that will allow you to finish the race well. Let's bow and pray together this morning. God, we thank you for this teaching. And as we come to the end of Hebrews, we're just so grateful for this study that we've been on as a church. But God, today, as we think about this idea of faith as a race, God, we would just simply come to you and we would want to acknowledge the truth of your word, which is that it's a challenge for us. That running the race of faith, especially for those of us who have done it for a long time, it's a challenge of perseverance. It's a challenge of endurance. And God, we understand that endurance is ultimately due to sin. Whether it is the sin, our own sin that weighs us down and trips us up, or if it's the sin of others, the brokenness of the world, we understand that these are challenges that we must overcome and that we only can do so because of our pacer, who is Jesus. We're grateful that through his work in the world and specifically his death and resurrection, that we look to him as the author and the finisher of our faith, the pioneer and perfecter and our champion. God, we're grateful for Jesus and that we have him and we can run our race with him. But we also understand the absolute essential part of this teaching, which is that we also need discipline, because faithfulness is impossible without discipline. So God, help us to accept godly discipline from you, our Heavenly Father. Help us to recognize that sometimes that discipline will be cultivated by just enduring. Other times it will be a direct result of your intervention in our lives, and we understand that both of those things will be painful. But God, help us to see through your word today. Help us to see how these are gifts from you. And just like all of the blessings you have given us, we also see that discipline is a gift as well. And so, God, we ask that you would help us to cultivate your discipline in our lives. God, we know that this is only possible through the Spirit working in and through us. And so, God, we want to simply submit ourselves humbly to you as our Heavenly Father who disciplines his children that he loves. So we thank you for this today. Thank you for this teaching. And it's in the name of Jesus we all said, amen.